What's good, creative fan? Brandon Washington here, and in today's video I'm going to be walking you guys through my personal settings when it comes to setting up the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. Now this is going to work whether you're shooting on the 4K or the 6K, but in this video I want to not only show you guys how to actually set this thing up to get proper images, but more importantly I want to show you guys some of the shortcuts that I personally use in order to operate this camera. As a lot of you guys noticed and commented in my last video on the Blackmagic, is that I use this thing in a pretty beefy rig, which also includes having the battery slapped right up against the screen. And a lot of you guys ask me, well, how do I actually use this camera when the screen is being blocked by the battery? So this video is not only going to show you guys the settings that I use, but also how I go about actually using this camera without actually having to touch the screen very much. But without further ado, let's jump into those settings. Alright, so to set this thing up, we're going to first hop into our settings, and we're going to press that little button on the side that has the 3 lines, and we'll get to a screen that looks like this. Now, it is super important that before you start filming that you go ahead and set your Kodak and quality before you even get going, as well as your resolution. Now, typically for most projects, I actually shoot in ProRes, and here on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera 6K, if you're shooting in ProRes, you only have the options of actually shooting in Ultra HD, 4K, or HD. 4K is normally plenty for me, but yeah, no matter which camera you have, you want to set these things up before you actually block the screen. Now, when it comes to setting this guy up, most of the setup is actually going to take place in your setup tab. Now, in the setup tab, there's a couple different windows, and I'm going to skip past a couple of these until I get to this screen here, which is on the second page, which is our function buttons. Now, the function buttons are pretty much where I do most of my setup. I love the function buttons on the top of this camera because it allows me to quickly dial in certain looks or even certain settings without actually having to do too much work. So for example, you'll notice that on this screen here underneath function 1, I have it set to a preset. And what this preset is going to allow me to do is basically to go ahead and have the camera switch to a certain setting based on what I want it to be. So for example, down below underneath where it says preset or function 1, you have all the different setting options you can choose from. So for example, I have frames per second, iris, white balance, or ISO, or shutter. And so for example, let's say I wanted to be able to quickly set my camera to ISO 400, since that is one of the native ISOs. This is all I would need to do. Now, once this is all said and done, if I go back to my recording screen, and you'll notice that right now, for example, my ISO is set to 160. If I actually just hit that function 1 button, you'll see that my ISO jumps to 400. This works out really well if you're in situations where you need to quickly be able to bump your ISO to a specific mark. Typically, if I am in a situation where I'm shooting, let's say I'm shooting outdoors, and I need my ISO to be set at 400 so that way it can have the native ISO, but then I also want to be able to quickly switch to ISO 1600 in case I go indoors really quickly and I need to bump that ISO switching from outside to inside. This is exactly what I'll do to keep it easier for me to be able to switch my camera without a whole lot of fuss. Now, that isn't the only thing that you can do here. Obviously, if I go back into the settings, you can see that I can even do the same thing with frames per second. As of right now, I have it set to 60. I have my iris set to be dropped all the way to 2.8 for that same type of a situation. My white balance, I like to be able to quickly switch to 5600 Kelvin because it's normally pretty close. Or, of course, the ISO. And then my shutter is always set to 180. Now, I never really change my shutter angle, so I love to leave this here just on ISO 400. And again, it really depends on the shoot, but this is one of those things that I'll set up before I even get started. Now, with the other function buttons, I do like to make some other adjustments. So for example, if I hop over into function 2, you'll notice that I have the option to have my display LUT turned on or off. Now, some people like shooting with their LUTs on and off. Some people don't. Some people want to be able to toggle back and forth. This is an awesome way that you can do this, but there are a lot of different options in here. For example, I can have my frame guides here. I have focus assist, which I like to turn on and off. This is actually something I typically have set for function 2. But also you can have your false color turning on and off here, zebras, and so many other options. And the best part about all these different options that you can have on screen and being able to switch it on and off is you can determine from here if you just want it to toggle on your LCD on the actual back of the camera or through the HDMI port if you're hooking up to a monitor. So for example, something like the display LUT, I may actually have that toggling on and off on the actual HDMI, since I'm typically viewing everything on the HDMI screen, but I maybe doesn't want it to affect my LCD and vice versa. So you can set all that up here in the functions. I typically like to have focus assist, and I'll have that set to the HDMI and LCD at the same time, because I really do like the Blackmagic's focus assist and how it works really well with this camera. Now, the last thing here in this function section that I really want to talk to you guys about is a clean feed. I love having a clean feed, because if you have a bunch of stuff on the screen and you want to be able to just fully be able to see what your image is going to look like, the clean feed is the best, and honestly, in my opinion, it is the quickest way to do a lot of things. One, if you happen to be going out over HDMI to a monitor for your clients to be able to see, being able to have a clean feed option, so that way your clients are just seeing the actual feed and they're not seeing all the settings and all the other pollution that shows up on the screen, is really, really helpful. On top of that, if you're ever trying to go out to a recorder or a capture device or anything like that for going live, being able to toggle your clean feed on and off very quickly is going to be super helpful, especially if you're going out over HDMI to some other type of setup. So if you're going live or you're recording to a recorder like the Ninja 5, you're going to need a clean feed, so that way the recorder on the Ninja isn't recording all of the Blackmagic settings that could be sent out over that HDMI as well. Now, the functions are just one area where I do a lot of my setups. The other one is actually in an area called presets. So if we tap right here on presets, you'll notice that right now there are no presets set up on this camera, because I want to show you guys how I actually go about setting these up. Now, the most important thing about presets is that your camera needs to already be in the settings that you want your presets to be working within, or you want to be a part of your preset. So for example, if I come back out of here and I go to my main recording screen, I'm going to start in my menu, actually, my main recording screen, and you'll see that my settings are all up at the top here. So I have my frames per second set to 60, shutter angles at 1/80. There's no iris because there's technically no lens on this guy right now. I have my ISO set to 400, but right now my white balance is actually set to 8400 Kelvin, which is just way too high. So I'm actually going to go ahead and bring my white balance down, and I'm going to bring that down to 5600, which is kind of a daylight, and it's a nice little area to kind of start with. So I'm going to have that set. And so, and my tint is set to 10, which is fine. So you'll see that all of my settings are currently dialed in, but these aren't the only settings that your preset is going to hold on to. If we go back into our settings and we go to things like our record. So right now I'm shooting in 4K in ProRes. That's going to be a part of the preset. If I go over to audio, you'll notice that right now it is using the camera microphones. And if I leave it like this, this will also be saved in that preset. So if you ever find yourself shooting the same type of thing, or you're shooting in the same scenario very regularly, creating presets are going to be the best way. So get all of your settings, all of them, everything dialed in exactly the way you want it to be. If you want there to be a certain LUT on screen, if you want to have your monitor settings a certain way, everything there. And then we're going to go to presets. We're going to click on the plus button, and then we can title this preset. So you can call this, you know, studio set. So I'll just type this in real quick. Perfect. So I've got studio set. I'll hit update, and now you'll see that I have my studio set as a preset. So now if I go back into my settings, and let's just start changing everything. So I'm going to switch it to 29.7. I'm going to grab my ISO, crank that up, take my white balance. I'll crank that back up to 7800. And then I'll go into my settings, go underneath record, and I'll go Blackmagic Raw in 6K. And so clearly right now, these are not even close to the settings that we had just a few moments ago. But if I go right back into my menu, and I go to presets, and I tap on studio set, and I hit the little check button there, you'll notice that if I come back out of here, all of my settings went right back to the way they were. I'm back at 60 frames per second. ISO is back to 400. White balance is at 5600 Kelvin. And if I go into my records data here, you'll see that I'm back at ProRes in 4K. But there you have it, guys. Those are my settings when it comes to setting up the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, whether it's a 4K or it's a 6K. Those are the ones that I use the most. Now this camera here, I will be rigging this thing out very soon, and it'll be fairly similar to the same rig that I already did for my 4K. But if you guys are interested, or you guys want to know some more comparisons, whether that's 6K versus 4K, or some of the differences, if you're out there looking for some, leave your questions down below in the description. And thank you guys so much for checking out this video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.